Many countries in the region have questions and concerns about China as a rising power. As its economy grows, as its military modernizes, how is that going to change China's intention?
I think there's such a word just to keep the finger to the China's nose, condemning Beijing status quo change is too much.
For you to point at us and say, hey, what you're doing is escalatorial, because if you do a modest increase, we will have to do more in order to keep the gap.
Yeah, since
that doesn't make sense.
There's a new era of hedging, in a way, that countries need to find ways to achieve their national interests in the context of a new power balance in the region.
Earlier this month, China hosted a massive military parade marking the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II.
70年前的今天，中国人民经过长达14年艰苦卓绝的斗争，取得了中国人民抗日战争的伟大胜利。
It was a showcase of its latest weaponry. China has been modernizing its military and increasing its defense expenditure by double-digit percentages every year for almost 2 decades. China claims territorial rights over the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. The islands are controlled by Japan. There have been numerous cases of friction between patrol vessels of the Japan Coast Guard and ships from the Chinese government that have trespassed into Japanese waters. Japan has been strengthening its alliance with the US.
Together, our forces will be more flexible and better prepared to cooperate on a range of challenges.
Thank you.
Prime Minister Abe's administration is pushing a set of bills that would allow the country to exercise its right to collective self-defense and enable the self-defense force to respond to an armed attack against an allied country. But the public is sharply divided on the issue. Those opposed say the legislation is against the war-renouncing constitution. Tensions are mounting in the South China Sea. China claims sovereignty over most parts of the area. This year, China embarked on an ambitious reclamation project to build new military bases in the Spratly Islands. The US doesn't recognize the Chinese claims to those islands. It says they are in international waters. The Pentagon has been flying a Navy surveillance aircraft in the area to track China's military expansion. The Chinese countered with a warning.
Foreign military aircraft, this is Chinese Navy. You are approaching our military alert zone. Leave immediately.
70 years since the end of World War II. The dynamics in the Asia-Pacific region, where the US had been the dominant power, are undergoing enormous change.
Welcome to Global Agenda. I'm Miki Barra, Editor-in-Chief of NHK's 24-hour news Newsline. 70 years on since the end of World War II, the Asia-Pacific region is now facing growing uncertainty. As China rises in its economic and military power, Japan responds by strengthening its alliance with the US. And the US is trying to manage its relationship as a regional balancer. What does it take for the three major countries to reduce the risk of conflict and to ensure security and stability? Today, we have 4 distinguished panelists. Let me introduce each one of them. Dr. Ivan Medeiros, an expert of China and America's Asia policy. He served as the Senior Director for Asian Affairs on the White House National Security Council to June this year. Mr. Yukio Okamoto, Japan's foreign policy expert and a former diplomat. He served as special advisor to 2 former prime ministers in the past. Professor Zhu Fen, China's foreign policy expert, Executive Director of the China Center for Collaborative Studies of the South China Sea and Professor of International Relations at Nanjing University. Professor Richard Samuels, a long-term researcher of Japan's politics and security issues. He's the founding director of MIT's Japan program and director of the Center for International Studies. Thank you to all of you very much for participating in our program. First of all, events are taking place around the world commemorating the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. A military parade was just held in Beijing. It was a huge one, to which leaders countries like Russia and South Korea attended, whereas those of the US and Japan didn't. Professor Zhu Fen, how important was it for China to have this grand occasion?
Well, I think military parade, of course, in the domestic political term, is a very significant event for the Xi Jinping administration. First of all, I think holding this military parade usually is a very big symbolic event for the new leadership to, we say, have a great power consolidation. So we also know 3 years almost passed since Xi Jinping took office. So it's a quite right and a traditional moment for him to show some sort of such a power control in China. So military parade will very symbolically just signaling his personal, control and personal popularity. I really hope international community will not just see military parade is just a 100% power show of China. I see it's more domestically motivated.
Mm-hmm. What about the announcement of the reduction of 300,000 soldiers from the army? What does that mean?
I think it's a very smart response from the Xi Jinping administration to mitigate the international concern for the China's, for example, military muscle flexing by holding the parade. On the other hand, we also see there's a big necessity for PLA to trim down because the size of the army is truly very sizable. It's too much big. So then there's a long-term some sort of a domestic overhaul on how China's military structure could just, escalate into some sort of a better position.
Dr. Medeiros, what sort of message do you think that China wanted to send to the world?
Well, I agree with Professor Zhu's analysis. First and foremost, the message that Xi Jinping wanted to send was to the domestic audience, that he's a strong leader, he's in firm control, and that he's going to continue to vigorously carry out his domestic mandate, which is anti-corruption and economic reform. Secondly, his message to the international community was China's risen, China's strong, China will not be bullied as it was in the first half of the 20th century. And in particular, I think it was in part a deterrence message to the United States and to Japan that China is going to use its military capability to protect its territorial integrity and its sovereignty, and that China will be a major player in the Asia-Pacific security environment in the future.
Mm-hmm. Professor Samuels, what's your take? And also, I would like to ask you, what kind of era are we living after 70 years after the World War II?
Well, we've been fortunate that the era of those 70 years has been a peaceful era, largely, certainly for the great powers in the region. The rise of China, per force, means the relative decline of the United States. in the region. And countries are balancing and dealing with it. But it's more than simply realigning or rebalancing. It's about asking tough questions and making difficult choices about how close to get to the great powers on the part of the smaller countries in the region. How close and how far away to be from China, for example. How close and how far away to be from the United States. And so if there was a single way to characterize it, in my mind, is that there's a new era of hedging, in a way, that countries need to find ways to achieve their national interests in the context of a new power balance in the region.
Right. Mr. Okamoto, a quarter of a century has passed since the end of Cold War. Is the security situation in the region different from what you'd expected?
Well, say 50 years anniversary from the end of the war, which was 1995, I had predicted much more conciliatory mood to prevail between Japan and China, Japan and Korea. But unfortunately, the evolution took quite the other way. Japan's relative decline of economic power with its capability to assist other Asian countries. Of course, spectacular rise of Chinese economic power with its military expansionism. Rising nationalism in China and in Korea is still making rapprochement impossible in this region.
One big element that caused friction between the neighboring countries has always been how to perceive the history, how we recognize the history. Prime Minister Abe delivered his statement on the 70th anniversary of the end of the World War II in August. What was the significance of that statement?
I think the overall tone of the statement was quite positive, forward-looking. And you must remember that prior to that, this April, Mr. Abe made a rather moving speech at the American Congress, citing Bataan, Corregidor, Coral Sea, and expressed his repentance over the war. I'm sure Mr. Abe will do the same if he is given the same opportunity in China and in Korea. So I think Mr. Abe is really willing to go for reconciliation, but unfortunately it has not taken place yet.
Professor Samuels, your take? Well, I also think on balance, on net, it was better. It was better than we might have hoped. Certainly better than the opponents of Mr. Abe expected. It did have something for everyone in it. There's one thing to say about the speech, though, and what makes it, in my mind, a missed opportunity in a way, which is he had the chance to really transform relations in the region. And to transform the way the Japanese think about the past. He acknowledged. He said that there would be no need going forward for apologies, and I thought that was exactly right. I think the time for there's a fatigue in Japan, and maybe in the region, for more and more apologies. Perhaps it should be the last apology, but only if it's accompanied by something else, which he didn't mention, which was the need for the need to move from apology to memory, to remember what happened and to teach the history, and to bake into Japanese civic culture the history in a way that allows folks to reflect on what happened and to confront it truthfully. And that's something that I didn't see him fully embrace, which I wish he had.
Professor Chu?
Yeah, I think that Abe's statement on August 14, of course, January is not bad because he mentioned the invasion twice, and he also emphasized the continuity of previous, the Prime Minister's statement and a remorse and some sort of, apology. But the real effect of Abe's statement in terms of, we say, mitigation of the, some sort of concern and worries over the Japan's revisionism will be very contending and even, my view, is very contentious. 2 points just truly concerns me too much. One is Abe expressed the deep thanks for the post-Second War Japan's revival. But all such a gratitude and thanks just definitely go to the West, where the Asian is. Japan geographically is an Asian power. So some sort of like Asian countries, I think the embracement to the pacifist Japan, I think is a very important contribution for the Japan's post-Second War, we say thriving. But Abe mentioned no words in his expressing the gratitude. The other no words to the Asian country. The second point I want to say here is at the end of his statement, Abe put a great highlight on value diplomacy. He's swearing that Japan will align with the same value, democratic power in assuring the peace and stability. That really upsets me. I don't think that in the Americans' foreign policy vocabulary, the value diplomacy remain some sort of eminent, the words. But Abe is still holding high such a flag of the value diplomacy. It will, it seemed to me, increase, separation between the Japan and other Asian countries, particularly with China. So then I have to say his wording on remorse and apology is good, but the problem is the real implication for the historical reconciliation is very bad.
Dr. Medeiros, how has that statement been taken by the U.S. or people in the U.S.?
Well, obviously speaking for myself, I would say the statement was seen as a very serious and constructive one. I see it as part of a continuum of statements that Prime Minister Abe made this year, beginning in January. Then, of course, his statement, as Yukio pointed to, before the U.S., both houses of Congress, which was a really extraordinary historic statement that was very moving as an American for the apology he gave for the aggression against the United States. But let me just emphasize Professor Samuel's point, which is I agree with him. There have been enough apologies. The question really is not apology. The question is more action. And can Japan move to a point in which there is memory and discussion of history issues and civic culture, not in a way that's sort of a stone around the neck of the Japanese people, but rather as a way to ensure that the history is not repeated and to reassure countries in the region that Japan, the Japanese people, understand their past in order so that it doesn't happen again.
Very quick comments about what the three discussants have been saying. Professor Chu, the value diplomacy simply means democracy and freedom, as simple as that. And if you heard Mr. Abe only thankful of what the Western world has been doing to Japan, if there is such a nuance, that is because of, in my pure conjecture, a rather delicate reason. We have been apologizing, as Dick has described as apology fatigue, and our apology has been accepted, and forgiveness was given by the United States and Europe, Australia, but it still has not come from China and Korea. So Mr. Abe might have thanked for the forgiveness given to Japan.
Yeah, if that case is real, I think the policy implications will be particularly worse. I think thanks is one thing, maybe forgiveness is another thing. So I don't think the two things can completely overlap. Japan couldn't just precondition its sanctions very exclusively to any forgiveness. For me, I think the Chinese forgiveness is clear-cut. So when the Chinese say, or Koreans say, yes, we need some sort of apologize, the reason is we frequently challenged by some sort of revisionist rhetorics over the history. So then, excuse me, that's my thought.
I don't disagree with you on that point. But reconciliation takes two to come together. And with regard to what Dick and Evan was saying, I think I agree with them that conveying the true history to our future generation is really indispensable for future Japan. And in that regard, our government is restructuring our high school education on history, and they are establishing modern and current history as an independent set of curriculum, during which time Japanese high school kids will be given ample lessons about what we had done in a wrong manner, I hope.
To bring that back to the events we opened with, the military parade in Japan, in China, it raises a question. Is a big military parade, is that going to bring about reconciliation? How is a huge demonstration of Chinese military strength going to encourage Japan and China, Japan and Korea, to ensure that history issues don't detract from the security environment? When I was in government, a point that I would regularly make to my counterparts from Northeast Asian countries was, it's important not to forget that the United States fought a brutal war with Japan and fought a brutal war with Vietnam. But yet, in 2015, we are close friends and allies with Japan, and we're good friends with the Vietnamese. We have multidimensional relationships with both. So reconciliation is absolutely possible.
Okay, let's move on to security strategy of the U.S., Japan, and China in the Asia-Pacific region. First of all, Japanese security situation is undergoing historic changes. Last year, Abe's administration changed how to interpret Article 9 of the war-renouncing constitution and made it possible for Japan to exercise its right to collective self-defense. And now Abe is pushing the set of security bills that will allow SDF to support an allied country, even Japan is not under a direct attack. Professor Samuels, in your book that you wrote in 2007, Securing Japan, you were already predicting that this trend would happen. How do you see the situation now?
If you go back and look at the changes to Japan's security posture, Japan's defense program, it's really been a slow and very gradual progression. It hasn't been a matter of choppy transformations, one after the other. Mm-hmm. Prime Minister Abe has long, like his grandfather and others in his wing of the Liberal Democratic Party, have long been actively hopeful for a revision of the Constitution. He understood when he took power the second time that wasn't going to happen. Early on, he knew he wasn't going to get a revision of the Constitution. So he moved for a reinterpretation of the Constitution. Now, many say that this was a radical move and unconstitutional. The fact is, there have been many politically directed reinterpretations or interpretations of the Japanese Constitution starting back in the 1950s. In fact, it was an interpretation of the Constitution by the Cabinet Legislation Bureau directed by the Prime Minister at the time that led to the creation of the self-defense forces to begin with.
Mr. Okamoto, there is a growing voice of opposition among the public this time. Did Prime Minister Abe underestimate the potential opposition, resistance to this move?
Well, in all frankness, I think he could have penetrated to the usual household's mentality more, using more immediate examples. I'll give you one episode. I was talking to 30 university students, and I asked them at the outset, how many of you are opposed to the new security bill? And out of 30, 20 hands went up rather forcefully. How many of you support the new legislation? Only one. So I told them, please listen to my story. Talked for half an hour. Can you put up your hands again? Who are still opposed to the bill? Only 4 went up. I'm not boasting about my power of persuasion, okay? What I want to know is that the public is not still really given the true meaning why this legislation is necessary. So I was asking if your loved ones, if your friends are isolated in overseas conflict situation, we have to count on the goodwill and sacrifice of other forces to protect our own citizens. Now, is this an auspicious and happy status quo to go back? That will perspire if we kill the entire bill. It's not going to be the embodiment of a peaceful, responsible nation. And the students agreed, and I believe in that situation. I mean, the status quo has to be changed.
Yeah, but under what condition
Yes.
Japan's status quo change could also risk little to shake up regional security. The problem is in one way, it could just, create some sort of a useful parallel in Asia, achieving the reconciliation with Koreans and the Chinese. I think it's another very important task force Abe administration needed to stand for. Otherwise, I will see such a real effect will be a reversal. For example, even psychologically, Chinese and the Koreans will consider when Japan militarily more aggressive, then we also have to do something to get us to feel safety. So then we will see the arms race or other some sort of a security conflicts, even potentially, also will emerge. So then I hope the Abe administration could make such a two ends meeting.
So you're saying that the direction it is going,
Yes.
it's perceived in China as a threat?
I can't say it's a 100% rate because objectively we will see Japan's military spending always go flat in the past more than 10 years. On the other hand, we also see Japan's security enhancement. Yes, now it is just going on, but not in a way very remarkable and massive compared to China. Japan's some sort of a security enforcement now is relatively less impressive. But the problem is for Chinese, what worries us is the prospect is some sort of a trend, such an action and reaction cycle among the Washington, Tokyo, and Beijing. So from this point, my view is this: China shouldn't overreact to the Japan's security enhancement by adopting the new security bill. But on the other hand, I hope what could be really, really bearing in the Japan's political elite's mind is what's the Chinese sense, what's the Chinese and the Koreans feeling. It also could be taken into account.
Dr. Medeiros, you're called a key architect of Obama administration's rebalance policy to Asia. What role does the US-Japan Alliance play in this policy?
What we've seen since Prime Minister Abe came to office was we saw a partner that was very willing and capable and sought to increase its capabilities through the reinterpretation of the Constitution and these collective, and then the bills before the Diet on collective self-defense. And that's great, because that's what the United States wants and needs: capable, like-minded partners that want to work together to build a set of security relationships and architecture in the region that contributes to security and stability over the long term.
Professor Samuels.
So this is a story from a few years back. My wife and I were living in Tokyo at the time, and we went with some friends into Shibuya, to Bunkamura, for a concert. And it was a concert, they said, on world music. And there were really only two musicians on the stage. One was a Chinese musician playing the erhu, and one was a Japanese musician playing shamisen.
Right.
And individually, they made wonderful music. It was lovely to listen to. But when they tried, to my ears, when they tried to play together, it didn't work. It was discordant. It was harsh, and I thought, oh my, this is not good. And then, at the very end, the curtain parted in the rear of the stage, and we found there was a piano there. And a young man came out and started playing jazz riffs on the piano. And the erhu player started playing jazz on the erhu. The shamisen player started playing jazz. It turned out that the United States, American jazz, was the vernacular by which they could communicate with one another and be very creative without the Americans dominating. That piano player was very soft in the background, but he provided the opportunity. And I see that as a metaphor for how we go forward, is we step back, we expect the Chinese and the Japanese to take more responsibility for their own relationship, but we help them find a way to communicate that didn't exist before.
So the piano player, America's DoD, Department of Defense, has just published this report on Asia-Pacific maritime security strategy, in which it says, quote, China is unilaterally altering the physical status quo in the region, thereby complicated diplomatic initiatives that could lower tensions in regards to South China Sea and tension in South China Sea. How do you see this?
I can understand American concern, but I think there's such a word just to keep the finger to the China's nose, condemning Beijing off status quo change is too much. Today, the China's naval capability is proceeding, and the China is getting bulky. So whatever China stretch out, it causes a lot of concern. But how to get it away, or how to get it settled, I think it's a very important reminder. I think the DoD issued the report. On the one hand, I hope really Chinese could be more cautious, because international response is very important environmental factor to ensure the China's economic and social advancement. But on the other hand, I really hope international community will not just simply overplay the China's some sort of territory claims in the disputed area.
Yes, Mr.
Dick's metaphor about the music of two countries was very interesting. In that case, at military level, China is playing with 10 erhus. Japan is playing with only one shamisen, so the discord becomes even louder, even more apparent. I have to totally disagree with Professor Chu's remarks about Japan overplaying our self-defense policy. The total now size of Japanese self-defense forces is barely 210,000, less than a total force of the Kingdom of Thailand or Myanmar. Japan, as you yourself have pointed out, its military budget since the year 2000 has been flat. Whereas you have expanded by close to 300%, your mighty armada of naval fleet, and you are saying that our action only to raise to a modest level, because mind you, even if we passed this security bill, the collective right of defense that we will be able to exert is very limited. We can exert this right only it relates to the Japanese subsistence being endangered. It's a very, very restricted form of collective right of defense. And so for you to point at us and say, hey, what you're doing is escalatorial, because if you do a modest increase, we will have to do more in order to keep the gap.
Yeah, Sensei,
that doesn't make sense.
Yes, Sensei, I can't agree with you more. So China in the military build-up outpaced Japan very much. But the problem is Japan's military build-up is not long. Behind you is most powerful countries in the world history. It's the United States. Military alliance between the U.S. and China is outer width and outer way. The China not too much is a great deal. So I don't think that China is in any position to rival U.S. and Japan at the same time. If the Beijing adopt that policy, I have to say it's really, really stupid. So what we're afraid of is such a big mind of the U.S.-Japan alliance also could force the Chinese to succumb or to subject. So that kind of the game of the power competition and the power struggle will extending.
From the piano point of view?
Well, let me just say that first and foremost, the piano is big and very substantial. And so even though China may have 10 erhus and there's only one Japanese instrument, there's a big piano in the room, and the Obama administration has done a lot to make sure it's a very modern, high-tech piano that can play a whole variety of different songs. When Americans talk about the U.S.-Japan Alliance, revitalizing it, growing it, it's not meant as a statement directed at China. It's not meant to sort of implicitly or explicitly threaten China. Rather, it's meant to be a statement about what we believe contributes to security and stability over the long term in the region. And in many of the meetings that I had when I was at the White House, with the Japanese, we would regularly encourage our Japanese counterparts to find a way to improve Japan-China relations. Mm-hmm. And we have to be honest with ourselves. Many countries in the region have questions and concerns about China as a rising power. As its economy grows, as its military modernizes, how is that going to change China's intentions? The fact that Xi Jinping chose for the first time ever to hold a big grand military parade to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the end of Japan's surrender in World War II, that raises questions and concerns about China's long-term intentions. And it's that uncertainty that is one of the factors that contributes to a very dynamic security environment.
How would you describe the current status of U.S.-China relationship?
Greatest achievements of the Obama administration is the fact that they built a U.S.-China relationship in which the channels of communication at the very top levels are broad and deep. So even though there's cooperation and competition, there are very effective mechanisms for managing the competition and growing the cooperation. That said, we're going through a very dynamic period right now. As you know, Xi Jinping is coming for a state visit. There's a lot of attention focused on what can we get done? How do we use the state visit as a forcing function to demonstrate that there is a stable modus vivendi between the United States and China on difficult issues? Difficult issues including the question of territorial disputes, difficult questions like cybersecurity.
Japan-China relationship, how could we build trust that's not there between the two countries?
First of all, I think we should keep in mind the Dick's metaphor. So yes, initially we have a lot of discordance, but the problem is we should search a way to fit each other, readapt ourselves to each other, then sooner or later we can have some sort of a new underlying the groundwork to reset our bilateral relations. The second is China-Japan relations is not alone. The U.S. is a very important factor, not far from how such relations could evolve. So Evan mentioned, for example, Americans' concern to the Chinese mutual trade. I totally agree. So then it should be some sort of a recognizable factor for Chinese leadership. But on the other hand, I can't just agree so the mutual trade is definitely equal to the flexing the muscle or just showing the China's aggressiveness. So the key factor for Chinese, Japanese, Americans, for me is China should stop any stop any overreach. Then our Japanese friend, Americans, colleagues should stop overreacting to the China's some sort of rise and the claims. So we need to find a way to stay in some sort of coordinated and a cooperative manner.
Later in September, world leaders will gather here in New York City for the UN General Assembly because the UN will be commemorating the 70th year of its foundation. President Obama, President Xi Jinping, President Park Geun-hye, Vladimir Putin, Prime Minister Abe will all be here. What can and must leaders do in order to secure the stability of Asia-Pacific region? I would like to ask you, Professor Samuels, first, you believe that leadership matters in shaping the course of events in history, right? What can they do?
Well, I do believe leadership matters, and it's so obvious as to seem trivial, but we forget that. We talk about great forces that are shifting the behavior of states, but the behavior of states is based upon decisions made by leaders. So what we're looking for is a leader in the region, in the world, who's willing to step up and within the context of the constraints that all leaders confront. Every leader is constrained by those great forces, stretch the constraints and offer up something different, something novel. And the last time we saw that, it seems to me, was back in the 1970s when Richard Nixon transformed world politics by visiting with quote unquote his old enemies in Mao and Zhou in Beijing. It's that kind of statesmanship that I'm looking for. I thought Mr. Abe had the opportunity to undertake, and that we're still waiting for from the world leaders at this point. We have to remember one final thing, which is that what Japan does is going to depend upon its answers to those questions that I opened up with in this conversation. It's how close or how far, not just to be with the United States, but how close or how far to be from China. What to get from its two most important bilateral relationships.
It's a very beautiful thought. I think the Dick made. It's very inspirational. So on the Chinese side, I really hope that Beijing should recognize nationalistic sentiments usually is double-edged sword. So we should get it very smartly and very relevantly modified and more pragmatically reach out to the Japanese leaders. So then even the parade, was at the preparation, there was a lot of a rumor Abe will come. So I consider it shows some sort of Beijing's new nuance. We should pull Japan into the boat. But unfortunately, both sides missed the chance.
I think that if the leaders of the United States, China, Japan, Korea, and Russia all came together and uniformly decided that they are going to work together to actively denuclearize North Korea, that's probably the single greatest contribution those leaders could make to long-term security and stability in the region.
And very, very briefly, what's the future of rebalance to Asia policy? Because of Mr. Obama's term will come to an end in a couple of years?
Yeah. It's a great question. My view is that the rebalance strategy has a very bright and vibrant future. I think that the United States crossed a very important political threshold in the Obama administration, in which American elites and the American public came to understand through the Obama administration's advocacy of this strategy that American economic and security interests were inextricably and increasingly linked to events in the Asia Pacific.
And lastly, Mr. Okamoto, when Prime Minister Abe is here, he's going to be here and make a speech at the United Nations. What kind of message can he deliver, will he deliver to the world?
Well, he has to appeal to the necessity of consolidation of Asian unity. I can agree with almost all the things that's been said here in the last 5 minutes. And the time is really pressing upon us, because at the risk of oversimplification and even becoming too provocative, my view is that if left unattended, Asia will be divided into Maritime Asia and Continental Asia. Maritime Asia meaning Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, Australia, and the United States. Continental Asia being the rest of Asia and Russia. 3 countries, Japan, US, and China, have a really tall task of doing something about this fissure from appearing. Territorial issues, I think we can put in the freezer if the 2 leaders intend to have the real rapprochement. The more important issue, in my view, is the history. And heretofore, the 2 countries could not even begin a dialogue on that issue because, in my view, Japanese views are diversified. So it will serve for many discussions. But China always comes with only one voice, official party line. But it has been a refreshing revelation for me listening to Professor Chu, because I had believed always that there is a freedom of speech in China, but no freedom after speech. But you have been frank enough, and if that reflects the changing openness, improving openness of Chinese society, then we have a hope for rapprochement.
I have to say China now is increasingly polarized. So social and even domestic, we say, diversity is a big factor. So the problem is the China-Japan relations is very, very special case. I see a lot of a monolithic approach from the most of people. So don't underestimate some sort of such a genuine monolithic, like character. So, but anyway, I see now the space is extending. So then there's a growing voice. So we couldn't just always indulging in very emotional thinking and a historical grievance. We should keep the face forward. So my view is that China-Japan relations shouldn't be just encapsulated in history. We should really, really keep the face to the future. But psychologically and even the mood, we should be open. So then it may be the key.
Well, I would like the discussion to continue. It's been very interesting, but time is up. So thank you very much for your valuable contribution. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Asia-Pacific region has enjoyed relative peace and prosperity in the post-Cold War period. But now, each leader is facing challenges to adjust to new power shifts of the 21st century and will likely to be struggling to seek how to sustain strategic stability in the region for the foreseeable future. I'm Miki Ebara. Thank you for watching Global Agenda.